Well, when Russell asked me to talk, I thought what I'm going to talk about, you know, I mean, when you're thinking about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Yeti, the abominable snowman, all these various creatures around the world, everybody's heard of them, but there's perhaps one group that a lot of people have not heard of, and that's the issue of the British Bigfoot. Reports of Bigfoot in Britain actually go back more than a thousand years, when they were known as wild men. So what I'm going to do for you today is sort of give you a background on the history of the wild man reports, the Bigfoot reports, that go back, as I said, literally more than 1,000 years in the UK, and look at some of the more interesting cases and try and figure out exactly what it is we're seeing and what these creatures might be, and certainly in the past what they might have been. Now, don't laugh. Look at all that hair. I don't know where that went, but it went somewhere. My interest, I'll just give you a bit of background, as I said. My interest in the whole angle of cryptozoology began when I was about 5 years old, and my parents took me on a week's vacation to Scotland, and while we were there we spent a day at Loch Ness, and that picture was taken just about a day or so before we went to Loch Ness. And if you've never been there, or if you have been there, you'll know that it's a very sort of atmospheric, huge body of water. It's roughly round about 22 miles long, a mile wide, and about 700 feet deep. So, in other words, it's an incredibly large body of water, and although you're not really able to tell from that particular picture, the water in Loch Ness is extremely dark and black, and it's caused by the fact that, as you can see, there's mountains and sheer hills all around it. And because it rains a lot in Scotland, what happens is that all of the dirt and the peat, as it's known, comes down into the water and blackens the water. So, in other words, it's very difficult to sort of actually go to Loch Ness and start to try and dig around for sightings of the Loch Ness monsters. But nevertheless, the sightings go back, the earliest report actually is 1,500 years old. And I guess when I went to Loch Ness for the very first time and stood on the shores of Loch Ness, it really sort of captured my attention as a little kid at the time. And I never forgot that first trip that I made to Loch Ness, and it sort of pushed me down that path of, well, you know, I'll start investigating things like this. And that's what I started to do when I was about 18, 19, and go on field trips and expeditions. And I've been to Loch Ness on many occasions now. And there's another reason why I talk about Loch Ness in this particular lecture, is to demonstrate that reports of strange creatures in the UK do actually date back a very, very long time. In other words, it's not just a new phenomenon. Now, as I said, the very first case of the Loch Ness Monster dates back to the 5th century, and the report came from a man named St. Columba, who was actually on the shores of Loch Ness, and when a man was actually killed, reportedly killed at least, by one of these creatures. What they are, we don't know. That's an artist's rendition of a plesiosaur, which is a marine reptile, assumed to have become extinct during the time of the dinosaurs. But that's probably one of the most popular theories for the Loch Ness monsters, is that they are surviving plesiosaurs. The main problem with that particular theory is that plesiosaurs lived in the oceans, which is salt water, and Loch Ness is fresh water. Now there are, excuse me, some animals which can exist in fresh water and salt water. We just don't know if plesiosaurs had that ability as well or not. Other theories include giant eels, giant salamanders, and various other explanations like giant catfish, that sort of thing. What it is, you know, I mean, we're still sort of asking questions. But as I said, for me at least, Loch Ness was the kind of definitive thing that set me on this path. Now, again, to sort of demonstrate to you further examples of weird creatures in the UK, We have a lot of reports of what back in the 13th and the 14th century were all referred to as worms, but they spelt it W-Y-R-M-S rather than W-R-O-R-M-S. And these worms, or so-called worms, were reported all around the UK, from the top of Scotland to the bottom of England. Nobody really knows what they were, but they inspired a lot of legends and folklores and mythology. And this is one particular story. As you can see, there's like a knight in armour fighting this weird worm-like creature. Now, some researchers believe or suspect that whatever these creatures are, they may somehow at least be interlinked or connected to the stories of things like the Loch Ness Monster. And the reason why I say that is because there have actually been a number of land reports of the Loch Ness Monsters. In other words, where they've been seen in the woods or on the beaches around the edges of Loch Ness. And these giant worms, as they were known, were also seen on land as well. So some researchers suspect they're actually one and the same thing, that the Scottish lake monsters and the Scottish worms are one and the same. Another example of what we have in the UK are what have become known as alien big cats. In other words, large cats which are seen in places where they shouldn't be seen. And certainly in the UK, there's no kind of indigenous large cat. Like, for example, this one is a melanistic jaguar. But people report things like this every year. There are literally dozens and dozens of sightings every year in the UK. And there's a lot of theories and ideas and concepts as to where these large cats might be coming from. Theories range from escapees from circuses and private enclosures. Some people, very controversially, do wonder on the possibility if there could be an indigenous unknown cat in the UK. But that's probably not going to work as a theory. But certainly the fact that these creatures have been seen in the UK for more than 500 years suggests that they have made a foothold in the UK, if nothing else. So what we have is this large body of data ranging from lake monsters, giant worms, big cats, the list goes on and on. So in that sense, it's not overly difficult to suggest that something along the lines of WILDMAN and Bigfoot might actually exist in the UK as well. Now, that's a friend of mine named Richard Freeman. Richard's the zoological director of a British organisation called the Centre for Fortean Zoology. And it's named after a man named Charles Fort. Charles Fort was somebody who, roughly a century ago, wrote a number of books on various unexplained phenomena. So the term Fortean is derived from Charles Fort, and the Centre for Fortean Zoology obviously gets its name as well. Now, Richard's been all over the world investigating a lot of other kinds of weird creatures, the Mongolian death worm, not unlike the worms I talked about in England just now. Also, he's been to Gambia and Guyana looking for their equivalents of Bigfoot too. But certainly the one that really stands out, which I'll also talk about, is ORANG-PENDEK. Now, the ORANG-PENDEK is a creature that's reported from the island of Sumatra. Now, I actually wouldn't be surprised at all if in the next couple of years we don't actually get proof of the existence of the ORANG-PENDEK. There's been some extremely good, solid reports in the last, about the last 20 years of people seeing this strange creature. That's the cover of Richard's book, which looks very much ape-like, long, powerful arms. The big difference is that it stands completely upright and just walks on its back legs. Excuse me, on its hind legs. And it stands about 4 feet tall, very powerful. Some people have said it seems to have a few human qualities, so we're not quite sure what it is. But if you go back into earlier years on the island of Sumatra, you do find reports of similar creatures, but which do actually seem more human-like, which has given rise to the idea that on Sumatra there could be two different types of creature. One that is a definitive unknown ape, and the other one which is, if you like, a wild man. And again, I mention this because this sort of parallels a lot of the British cases too. Now, that's an artist's rendition of one of the early wild men type characters in the UK. Now, that particular piece of artwork was done about 700-800 years ago. So in other words, it's not just something of the modern era that's been, you know, presented as something from the past. It really does originate in the deep past. Now, as you can see from the picture itself, you've got a creature completely covered in hair, but it has a very human-like face, and it's carrying a club as well. So if a picture like that is accurate, then at least with some of these reports, we're dealing with something that seems somewhat more human than it actually does seem to be animal-like. And so that begs the question, well, what were these wild men that were roaming around the forests of the UK more than 1,000 years ago? I should stress that the UK today is very different to how it was back then. I mean, today, you know, the cities have expanded here, there and everywhere. If you go back 1,000 years, pretty much all of the UK was covered in forest and woodland. So it wouldn't be difficult at all for these creatures, whatever they might be, to hide out in there. So that's one of the most important things to remember. Is today people say, well, how on earth could these creatures live in the UK and not be found? Well, that is a valid question, but as I said, if you go back 1,000 years, it's quite an actual, an understandable issue. So reports like this always sort of catch my attention, because whenever you look into tales of folklore, legends, mythology, you do generally find that at the heart of the mystery, there is a real mystery. It's not just a legend. And I think, we can make a good case for that, just simply due to the fact that there are so many reports of these wild man type reports from the UK. Again, that's another example just to show you how this sort of imagery spread all across the UK of these wild men. Again, you've got him sort of holding some sort of large stick, covered in hair, a beard, but again, a very human-like face rather than an ape-like face. So again, we have the development of this phenomenon of the wild man slowly spreading all across the UK to the point where these reports became pretty much accepted. If you look at and read at some of these stories of the ancient tales of wild men in the UK, they were very feared. There were sort of stories and legends of cannibalism and people going missing. And again, none of that really, should surprise us. If you've got colonies of creatures like this living in the woods 1,000 years ago, they would be, in some respects, predators in the same way that we would be as well. One of the earliest reports on record comes from a little town on the east coast of England called Orford. And Orford is home to a large castle. That's an artist's drawing of it. It's not in that quite good condition today. It's sort of tumbled down a little bit. But the story of the Orford wild man is one which actually continues to this day. The locals every year celebrate it with like a little... kind of like a little festival, a scaled down version of this, if you like. And so once a year they have these celebrations in the name of this strange, mysterious, hair-covered creature. Now, the story is that one particular day, a number of fishermen in the area caught this hair-covered wild man in the nets and managed to drag him to the shore, took him to the castle, and put him in the dungeons and basically kept him prisoner for a number of years. And the story goes that, to start with at least, he was sort of very wild and dangerous. Then after a couple of years, calmed down and became sort of very docile and worked along with the fishermen and seemed to actually be quite intelligent. except for the fact that, again, he was covered completely in hair. And then supposedly one day he decided to just leave the area, well, fled the area, I should say. They tried to track him down, but never did really find him. And so that's one of the, as I said, that's one of the earliest reports we have on record from the UK of what might conceivably be some sort of early Bigfoot, wild man, primitive human. So the big question is, well, what are these creatures? It's interesting, if we go further into Europe and then we go towards Russia, Russia has its own equivalent of the Bigfoot, the abominable snowman. It's called the Almasty. Now, what's interesting about the reports of the Almasty is that some people do describe them as looking like a Bigfoot-type creature. However, others have said they look more like a primitive man. As you see in this picture, sort of like the overly developed forehead, small nose, protruding jaw, long hair, and very powerful. It's possible, if we take all of the reports from Russia as a whole, that there might actually be two phenomena at work in Russia. The Almasty may not be just one thing. Some reports may be due to sightings of an unknown ape, a giant unknown ape. Others may actually be surviving pockets of Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon man, something like that, which would be incredible if we're able to prove it. But there is actually some data that pushes the reports in that direction. So some researchers of the British phenomenon think that back then, even if it's against all the odds, that perhaps there could well have been surviving relic pockets in the UK of something along the lines of Neanderthals or Cro-Magnons, which eventually died out, but which led initially to these reports and legends of the British cases of wild men. Now, most people have probably heard the legend and the fairy tales, folk tales of the babes in the wood, Hansel and Gretel. It's sort of a well-known story that you can find in various different cultures and countries all around the world. But the story actually began, the initial story, so far as we know, started again, interestingly enough, in a little village on the east coast of England, not at all far from Orford, where the wildman sighting occurred. This one was about 50 years later. Now, in the original story, it's the basic background is very different to the folk tales and stories of today. That's sort of the typical image that people have of the babes in the wood and the, excuse me, the Hansel and Gretel stories of two young children walking through the woods and nobody seems to know who they are or where they came from. Well, the original story is very different. Revolves around this little village on the east coast of England called WOOLPIT. And one particular day in WOOLPIT, two young children walked into the village. One was a young boy, one was a young girl, probably around about 10 years old. And they didn't look completely normal. Their skin was kind of like a greenish colour, had a greenish tinge to it. And they were coated in fine hair. And this gave rise again to another wild man type story in the UK. But over time, it became mutated and changed into this story, like I said, almost like a fairy story, a folk tale. And of course, the big question is, well, who or what were these children covered in hair and with this slightly green skin? For the people of that era, they were definitive wild children, feral children or something along those lines. But why would they look like that? There have been a lot of very controversial and certainly sort of even outlandish theories, you know, that they were alien children from a crashed UFO or something like that, which I don't believe at all. But it just demonstrates how in today's world there's sort of a new level has been attached to the story. But there's a couple of interesting pieces of insight when it comes to this story of these hair-covered children in Woolpit. There's actually a condition called lanugo hair, and lanugo hair occurs when somebody is in starvation mode. That's to say, you know, if you haven't eaten or you're barely eating, your body actually tries to react to the fact that very often your blood pressure can drop, your temperature drops, and so the body starts to develop this fine hair all over its body called lanugo hair. And you often find it in young girls who've got like bulimia or anorexia. It starts to develop on their cheeks and their face and on their arms. And so if you imagine these two children who supposedly had been walking around the woods of England for who knows how long, could have been months, were in starvation mode, it's entirely possible that the origins of their story being covered in hair may actually have been a distortion of kids suffering from malnutrition, exhaustion, dehydration, starvation, and they start to develop lanugo hair. There's also a particular form of anemia, which is also caused by a lack of a viable intake of food over a significant time period. And this particular form of anemia causes the blood to change colour to where the skin starts to take on a slightly green colour. So you put that green skin angle together, combined with the lanugo hair, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if this particular wild man story has its origins in something more along the lines of a tragic tale of two children who got lost and lived in the woods for who knows how many months and finally made their way to Woolpit. And I think it's very kind of revealing that within just a few months of living in the village with the local people, they started to lose the hair and they started to lose the green tinged skin because they were starting to eat more and they were becoming healthy again. So I think this is an interesting early wild man type report, which for this case at least, I think we can explain it, but it certainly doesn't explain all the reports. Now, that's a friend of mine named John Downs. John runs the Centre for Fortean Zoology that I mentioned earlier. That picture was taken when we were doing a Sci-Fi Channel show called Proof Positive out in Puerto Rico in the summer of 2004. Now, the show itself was basically to do a search for the chupacabra, the original chupacabra that surfaced on the island of Puerto Rico. But when we were out there, we actually got a number of stories of not unlike Bigfoot type tales, except for the fact they were smaller. They were described by the witnesses as being about the size of a chimpanzee, and certainly not the size of anything like a Bigfoot. But in saying that, there should not be any kind of indigenous apes or monkeys on Puerto Rico at all. So the big question is, what were the witnesses seeing? We spoke to probably 7, 8, 9, 10 people who'd seen the Puerto Rican Bigfoot, if you want to give it that name, and they described as very kind of athletic and fast-moving, kind of like a chimpanzee, but a little bit bigger, and its face was different. The face was more human, and kind of like with the British report, excuse me, the American reports, where hunters have said they've actually had a Bigfoot in their sights with their gun, but they decided not to shoot because it did have this sort of, almost like a human, intelligent looking appearance on its face. And people said exactly the same thing about the Puerto Rican creatures as well. So I just mentioned that to demonstrate that when you go to places around the world, particularly like Puerto Rico, which has this gigantic rainforest called the El Yunque rainforest, you often find cases like this, purely and simply, I think, because in these large territories which are seldom ever explored, things could live there that have lived there for centuries, maybe even longer, and to the point where people aren't looking for them unless you actually know about the stories and you go looking for them yourselves. Now, John had an interesting story to tell, or still has an interesting story to tell, which goes back to the Second World War and deals with a strange saga that kind of links the British Bigfoot with conspiracy. Now, back in the early 1980s, John worked at a place called Starcross Hospital in the city of Exeter, England, where he still lives. And John got one particular story from a retiring doctor at the hospital who said, hey John, you know, I know you're interested in these weird stories and strange tales. I've got one to tell you before I retire. And the doctor revealed how in the Second World War, a man was brought to the hospital and nobody knew who he was, where he came from, but he was covered completely in hair. And he was very sort of muscular, tall, but it was definitely human. It was not an ape-like animal. And the man was brought into the hospital, kept there for about a week, and then he was taken away in a big, large police van. Nobody ever saw him again. And this story sort of circulated as a legend around Starcross Hospital for a long, long time. And it did become sort of a piece of local folklore. And so John, while he was still working at the hospital and actually had access to the medical records of the patients there, decided to do some digging, you know, a little bit of personal detective work, if you like. What John found, interestingly enough, was that there was a family in the area who had one particular genetic issue going throughout their various generations. They all suffered from a condition called hypertrichosis. And hypertrichosis is a condition where the hair on your body and your face does not stop growing. It grows everywhere. And I'll show you a good example of this. That's a real picture of a person with hypertrichosis. It's just a regular, normal person. But, as I said, the only difference is that they're completely covered in hair. Now, unfortunately, in times long gone, people who had hypertrichosis were very often sort of looked at with suspicion, and the only works they could kind of get would be in so-called freak shows, as they were known back then, in carnivals and circuses. Fortunately today, you know, we know it's just a medical condition which can actually be handled to a degree with certain drugs, but it doesn't completely eradicate the condition. So John found out that there was this condition running through this particular family in the area, which was actually a very rich and powerful and influential family. And so the whole thing was covered up essentially to prevent any embarrassment, as it was known back then, I suppose, to make sure that nobody outside of the family actually knew what was going on. And it's sort of, like I said, a fascinating story of a strange creature that actually wasn't a strange creature at all. So I use this case to demonstrate that sometimes when we go looking for Bigfoot or wildman reports, generally we actually do find some evidence or some data, but it doesn't always go down the path that we may be thinking about to start with. And that's an old painting of somebody with hypertrichosis, again demonstrated. It's a very old condition. I think that one was painted round about the 1500s. Now, if we move things sort of more to the present day, this particular case was actually the first one I ever investigated when I was about 18 or 19. And this particular area, that canal, as you can see there, is called the Shropshire Canal, and it's circulated all across the UK, from pretty much the south part of England right through the north, called the Shropshire Canal. And it has a long history of a strange creature lurking around the woods and the bridge itself, and the creature has become known as the man monkey. Now, the first report of this creature surfaced in January 1879, and basically there was a guy walking across the bridge itself, pulling his horse behind him, horse and cart, and suddenly this large ape-like animal came charging out of the woods, jumped onto the back of the cart, terrified the man, terrified the horse, and then leapt off and vanished into the woods. And just the fact that this was a very sort of localized area, the story soon got around of this strange creature, which, as I said, became known as the man monkey. That gives you sort of another look at the canal itself. As you can see, the foliage, the trees on each side almost come together, and during the summer when the trees are sort of really at their fullest, it really does create sort of a canopy, so it looks like you're going through a tunnel. So in other words, it is very, very kind of a creepy, sinister place. Again, that's the bridge. Now, if I was to stand there, I'd probably come to about there. So, you know, you can see it's quite a big bridge, and it goes back about 200 years. Now, when the sightings began, they actually attracted the attention of the local police, who opened a file on this particular encounter. I guess you could call it almost like an early X-file, so to speak. This particular case was in the local newspapers, then actually made the national newspapers. The sightings went on for about 5 or 6 weeks, and then suddenly came to a halt. But there were other reports as well that did surface shortly after that. And to this day, people claim to have seen similar animals in this particular area. Now, one of the theories that was put forward, could it have been a chimpanzee on the loose? Another story surfaced about a gorilla on the loose as well. And again, this sort of parallels what we hear with a lot of Bigfoot stories from the US. Oh, they're not really Bigfoot, they're just gorillas that escaped from this circus or that circus. And the angle of animals escaping from zoos to explain a lot of these cryptozoological creatures. There are so many of these stories that, were it not for the fact that we know, we can prove that a lot of these stories are just urban legend. You know, it demonstrates to us how legends and tales can develop. There's no evidence really that any gorillas or chimpanzees in the UK have ever escaped. And certainly with the US reports as well, there's no evidence that, you know, there are dozens and dozens of gorillas escaping from zoos and then becoming the legend for Bigfoot. But you can find those kind of tales everywhere. Again, escaping from a circus. That's one of the theories that's been put forward for the big cats in the UK. They've all been escaping from zoos and private enclosures. Well, for the amount of reports we get every year of these large black cats in the UK, they must be escaping from zoos on a daily basis. And of course, that's just not happening. You know, people would find out, certainly the police would find out. So, but I find it interesting that, you know, no matter the country or the culture, what we find are these legends and urban legends developing. Oh, my aunt, my uncle, my sister told me about, you know, the large cat that escaped from the zoo down the road and it was all hidden and covered up. These stories, they're everywhere, but very, very few of them have any basis in reality. So in other words, I think when it comes to the man-monkey and all these other creatures, they're not escapees from zoos, they're something much stranger. Probably the most famous one in the UK is a creature that's known as the big grey man. That particular mountain range is in Scotland. It's called the Cairngorms, and the largest one there is called Ben Macdui. And Ben Macdui is the one mountain, more than any other, where people have reported seeing this creature known as the big grey man. And it's described as a humanoid figure, anywhere from sort of 7 to 9 feet tall. People talk about hearing this crunching of heavy, large feet, which again kind of creates a sort of a Bigfoot parallel, so to speak. Typically, the reports don't sort of emanate from the lower levels of the mountains at all. You know, where you've got the grass and the lower hills, there really aren't any reports at all. But certainly in the mountains, there's a lot of reports. And of course, one of the interesting things is there's a large population of sheep, goats, things like that. So in other words, there's certainly plenty of scope for these creatures to live there. And of the various people who claim to have seen these creatures, a number of them have described them as being something along the lines of a large ape. Very extended arms, muscular body, and an ape-like face. So again,
we're dealing with something in an area of the UK which is very, very rarely travelled and explored. And you know, you might find that sort of strange that in a relatively small country like the UK, that there could be places where very few people ever visit. But certainly the Cairngorms are one perfect example, primarily because, you know, you have to be a real good mountain climber to be able to negotiate those particular peaks. So again, could anything potentially like this live up there? I don't see any reason why not. I mean, the reports go back a very, very long time, and yet nobody really is willing to do the field work to actually get up there for extensive periods. Another strange one, which actually involves the British royal family, that's GLAMIS Castle in Scotland. That has a legend attached to it of a strange hair-covered humanoid figure that was reportedly kept in a secret room in the castle for about 120 years. So what this creature was, we don't know. It was reportedly to have a huge barrel-like body, covered in hair, and as I said, lived to be at least 120. And the story is that in one of the higher parts of the castle, there was this secret room that unless you knew how to get into it, you would never get into it. Theories again have been put forward as to what or who this particular monster of GLAMIS, as it became known, what it actually was. To this day, the family will not talk about it, which again is kind of intriguing and notable, suggests that there is some reality to the story. Now, as far as, you know, distances occurred, it's not a massive distance from the Cairngorms. So could we be dealing with something very similar? I think we could actually be something identical, never mind similar. Probably the weirdest story of all is we get a lot of reports from the UK of creatures that look like baboons. Now, that is one that, you know, I'm sort of at a loss to explain. We're certainly not talking about anything like a Bigfoot here, but it's, you know, it's worth noting that we are talking about something that's living in the UK that should not be here. And certainly the most famous case, or infamous case, surfaced in 1999 when two police officers saw something just like a baboon bound across the road. And they were so sure of what they'd seen, they actually put it in the logbook, and it, you know, became in the form of an investigation. Could some of these be escapees, you know, from labs where they do, you know, studies of animals? Maybe, I don't know. But why would it always be baboons that are escaping? Why not chimpanzees? You know, why not smaller monkeys? Things like that. I don't know what the answer is, but some people have suggested, some researchers suggested that maybe there could be isolated pockets of baboons that perhaps could have escaped and are now sort of thriving very nicely after decades of roaming around the UK. To bring things more up to date, that's an area called BOLAM in the north of England. And in the early part of 2003, there were a lot of reports of sightings of something which really you can only describe as a definitive Bigfoot. We're not talking about something along the lines of a wild man or somebody covered in hair, but what was described as literally like a huge ape-like animal. And the nation's media, the press, covered this extensively, and John and Richard, who I mentioned earlier, they both went out there, and John actually saw this creature racing through the woods, and his account of it in his book Monster Hunter is a very interesting one. He was literally sort of about 25 feet away from it. So again, you know, we have this wooded, forested area. People seeing these strange creatures that most people never give any thought to at all, but they may well be among us. So, in other words, and in conclusion, what we've got here is a phenomenon that is actually not at all unlike what we've got over here. If you look back in the early 19th century newspapers over here, you'll find stories of wild men. Some of them did look like literal wild men covered in hair. Others looked more ape-like. So I think it's possible, certainly, that in various parts of the world, there are these different categories, if you like. There are the wild men, the primitive humans that may have survived extinction, and we've also got the ape-like animals, maybe a few escapees, and that's basically it. So I think we are dealing with a real phenomenon. It's one that is sort of worldwide, not just US, UK, Russia. These things are everywhere. And I think the only way we're going to solve it is just by more and more field research, going out into the woods, into the forests, and when it comes to things like the Loch Ness Monster, you know, investigating the lakes as well. So I hope that's kind of given you a little bit of a background on an aspect of the Bigfoot phenomenon that most people don't really know anything about, the British Bigfoot, which for me, I'm not just saying it because I come from Britain, but I think, you know, it's one of those areas that is kind of misunderstood to a degree and also completely unknown to a degree. So, as I said, I hope it's kind of given you a background on this phenomenon, which demonstrates it's not just down to legend, it's not just down to mythology. There really is something out there in the UK. What it is, we're still looking for it. Thank you.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the Vortex.